This is the Planning Podcast, and I'm Richard Kimblin. Joining me today are Hawley and Thea Osmund-Smith. Together, they're going to take us through a practical set of issues, looking at a particular form of development, motorway service areas, and the practical consequences for an application or an appeal. And then we dig a bit deeper into very special circumstances and what constitutes the key element of a very special circumstances case. Let's see what they have to say. Hawley, hello and good morning.
Good morning, Richard. How are you?
Really good, and it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for helping us with this one. Go on, what's the topic?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me back. And this time I'm throwing out something of a curveball. The rather niche topic of motorway service areas specifically, or at least the provision of roadside services on the strategic road network across the UK.
So if you do this sort of work, are you allowed to grossly overcharge for everything? Is that the basic premise? So...
I think that is simply the process of recovering the immense costs of getting to the point of being able to serve somebody a coffee and a sandwich as a motorway service area. Sadly, those margins don't translate down the line.
Well, with that slightly pejorative start, let's kick off. So, MSAs, you're not going to tell us about weaving lengths, and because that will severely dent the listenership, I imagine. But just tell me, what are we into here? Are we into an area which is really busy and there's lots of activity? Because one might have thought that they've all been built.
Well, exactly that. And that's probably what my assumption was going back a number of years ago before I ever even contemplated the idea of working alongside providers of such facilities. And you're quite right. I felt that a deep dive into the design manual for roads and bridges at this point might well quickly end any form of subscription service to our podcast. But no, it was more the lighter elements of it. We all use them for better or worse. Some people love them, some people loathe them, but we all need them. And frankly, we often welcome those breaks, along the motorway journey. That they are a regular feature of everybody's commuting or whether they're going on holiday. And there is that assumption, well, the motorways were built many years ago, weren't they? We stopped building new motorways, or largely stopped building new motorways a long time ago. We tweaked them, we add lanes to them, we introduce technology to them, but we aren't building new motorways. So why do we need new services? Well, the answer is actually not all the required services were built to serve the motorway network, and there are still opportunities out there to plug what are effectively known as gaps. And it is a fiercely competitive market. That there is a lot of activity at the minute, and that competitive nature only increases as more locations are taken up, because of course it is a locationally specific operation. There are only so many opportunities on the network to provide these facilities.
Well, we're now heading into spatial planning territory, aren't we? We must be. If there's a question of where you put things, there must be a policy that tells you how many, and if so, where's a good spot? Is there a policy?
Well, yes, there is. That's absolutely right. I mean, just as a starting point, of course, a motorway service area must be on the motorway. So there is that logical requirement that you can only put them on motorways. Therefore, they must be along the corridor of motorways. And then in policy terms, there's the document, which is a Department for Transport document. So slightly unusual in the planning sphere that we're actually looking to a different department for our guidance. But that's DFT Circular 02/13, which obviously trips off the tongue, or at least it does mine now, having been involved in various proposals for motorways. Not a document that I'd come across prior to dealing with MSAs. But essentially what that document does is sets out the government's policy framework for the strategic road network more generally.
And what are they most bothered about? What's top of the tree in terms of deciding the where?
Absolute top of the tree is safety.
Okay.
So the provision of roadside services, the sole reason for them is to afford the travelling public the opportunity to take a break from their journey, because driver fatigue is one of the most significant causes of crashes, incidents on the motorway, and that isn't only harmful to life and limb, but of course also affects the economy. We always see these figures, don't we, about a traffic jam for 6 hours, and you can actually put a pound cost against that.
You can do all sorts of clever things with models that price all sorts of things in. I remember that from building bits of motorway myself. What does surprise me, though, is that you're telling me safety is in there, having a proper interval so that people can take breaks. So what on earth was going on? People building motorways that aren't safe so far as the provision of places to stop is concerned. It seems like there shouldn't be any gaps.
Absolutely, and that is effectively what the policy is saying. So it sets out minimum and maximum criteria. The minimum criteria comes back to that very point that we weren't going to delve into: weaving lengths.
No, no weaving lengths. Don't mention
No
weaving
weaving
lengths.
lengths
No.
at all. Suffice to say, they are different to those found in the textile industry. But the point is that a minimum separation is simply for safety, so that you just don't have too many people trying to get on and off the motorway on different slip roads. The maximum interval at 28 miles is calculated on the basis of affording the driver the opportunity to take a break. Obviously, you don't need to take a break every 30 minutes, but the opportunity to take a break at least every 30 minutes whilst travelling along the motorway, because the recommended guidance is that every 2 hours a driver should take a 15-minute break. And statistically, those who don't break their journeys are much more likely to be involved in an incident.
Well, let me try this one on you then. I've always explained to people who are daft enough to ask me the question, well, what is this greenbelt thing? I explain that the greenbelt is the place that you can't build a garage, but you can build a motorway. And so we've got lots of motorways going through greenbelts. Can you play your safety card to say, look, I've got VSC here, I can have a motorway service station? Does that work if you've got a greenbelt motorway? Is it that big a deal?
Your analogy is absolutely right, because all we need to do is substitute garage for MSA, but actually there is a difference there because of that very special need case. I give an example. Satnam and I have recently completed an inquiry for a new motorway service area on the M42. There is no doubt that there's a safety need, and a very significant safety need. It is said to be the second greatest need for a motorway service area in the country. The entirety of that section of the M42 runs through Greenbelt. Obviously, the MSA can be only located adjacent to the motorway. Therefore, it must be located in the Greenbelt. And that is exactly it. That whilst the circular tells us about the need for the provision of these services, it then hands off to the framework, which of course we're all familiar with, for the actual planning decision and undertaking the planning balance. So all of those factors that we'd normally deal with, and in this particular case, Greenbelt, they all come into play. But of course, what you're bringing in as part of your VSC argument is, well, there's a very strong need case here for this development in the Greenbelt. And then, of course, one has to look at all the benefits of the scheme, but look at the harm to the Greenbelt, giving that the substantial weight that it must be afforded, and the benefits need to clearly outweigh that harm in order for the development to proceed.
So do you end up then with a sort of greenbelt off where the competition is basically trying to explain how much worse in greenbelt terms your site is? My site is a terrible piece of greenbelt and therefore a very suitable place for an MSA as compared to the alternatives, because the very special circumstances, the ball point is available to everybody, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. And because of the relatively limited numbers of players in the marketplace who operate these facilities, they are undoubtedly all aware, given the scarcity of opportunities, of what the other is doing. So it is very competitive in that sense. And often what one finds is not only have proposals been on the drawing board, as it were, for many, many years, perhaps already been through inquiry once or twice themselves, but equally in that area, there'll be another competing proposal. If the stars align and you end up all at inquiry together, then that's exactly what it is. My scheme is less harmful than yours. Effectively, we all agree there's a need. And then there's that debate about who meets the need better, because the need is predicated simply on that maximum distance. But of course, you're serving all drivers on that route wherever they come from. So you end up in this quasi statistical and geographic exercise of working out where drivers might come from on the motorway network and which services they might pass to get to your services, and therefore how many miles they've traveled. So there's that. There's the I'm better than you in terms of meeting the safety need, but actually, not only that, my scheme is less harmful in greenbelt terms, or if we're not in the greenbelt, simply in impact on the countryside, landscape, and character arguments.
So they're classic alternative cases where, as you say, there'll be a substantial amount of common ground, and then a race to the bottom, really, in terms of the description of the quality of your bit of greenbelt.
That's absolutely it. And what makes the stakes really so high as well is because, particularly on a greenbelt site, in seeking to establish very special circumstances, it's quite clear that that safety need needs to be in your basket of very special circumstances. Without the safety need, it's difficult to imagine what else might amount to VSC in the greenbelt for a motorway service area. Once a decision is made, and once one of what may be many competing schemes in a certain location is approved, then of course that need has then disappeared, or largely disappeared, because it's been met by the proposal. So there will be a winner, and then it makes it very difficult for anybody else to come back even years in the future, because the need has been met and will continue to be met. So whilst it's similar to, I suppose, in a way, the supermarket wars we all saw, with everybody seeking to demonstrate that there was a need that they could take up, or seeking to judicially review permissions granted to others to protect their own supermarkets, there was, I suppose, at least the prospect of an increased need being demonstrable some years later, simply through population growth and retail changes. But in terms of locational need, which we're dealing with here, that is fairly static.
And what's the attitude amongst planning authorities? What I'm interested in is whether or not it's at all variable and different, whether some local authorities are interested in attracting an MSA because they consider it to have some benefits, or whether the position is fairly uniform. What is the sort of general attitude?
It's interesting that word general, isn't it? Because one looks at MSAs, and at first blush, what you think is, well, yeah, they're all the same, aren't they? They're all going to offer me a coffee, a burger, the opportunity to buy a newspaper. But actually, if you think about it, it might be conscious or subconscious. You probably, even you, Richard, probably have a preferred services on the motorway, for a route that you might take regularly or irregularly, but at least you know. And that might be based
No,
on the
no, no, no,
services.
not at. I navigate everywhere via farm shops.
Well,
Yes,
and that's it. That's the top of the tree. That's everybody's favourite. It's not only the services they offer, but also, just simply how easy it is to access them as well. I certainly know of certain services that I think, well, actually, I'm not going to stop here. I'm just going to carry on going to the next one, because I can't face that roundabout and then that other bit of section of road and then getting across the car park. So it's competitive in that way as well, that it's not just the services which are being offered, but also the ease of accessibility. And as to how local planning authorities approach that, they have been, as a rule, surprisingly welcoming. Greenbelt tends to be a bit different, particularly when a scheme is reported to members, because obviously members can often take a different view about green belt and whether or not there can ever even be such a thing as very special circumstances, because it's green belt and therefore it shouldn't be built upon, should it? Local planning authorities, they recognise the economic benefits. You mentioned farm shops.
Yeah.
What was interesting about that or what is interesting about that particularly well-known service is on the M5. It's not quite unique because there are others that do it, but the unusual nature of their provision, but also the way it operates. Because my understanding is that there's effectively some trust set up, and the jobs are for locals. The sourcing of the products is local. There is a degree of profit share as well. So in that sense, that is a particular scheme which stood on its own particular benefits in order to effectively secure a planning permission. But even a slightly more straightforward services can clearly lead to quite substantial economic benefits, which generally are to be welcomed.
I suppose you can think of examples, if you think Cumbria, where my preferences and MSAs coincide if you set up your whole services to in fact be a farm shop. So what you're saying is you can design both the theme and the structures associated with the facilities to hit a particular spot in the market, and that might be attractive. But what about the future? Do we need large hydrocarbon filling stations?
That's the real transition at the moment. I mean, what I would say is, over the last decade, maybe even the last 15 years, the facilities that have been offered at motorway service areas have substantially improved. We can all see the various brands and fascias which are now represented, and contrast that perhaps with travelling along a motorway in the 1980s, when one would be reluctant perhaps to stop at a motorway services that was effectively state owned and very much felt like that. I think the next big transition is, well, it is a facet of that which we're all going to go through, the transition to net zero. So, what is one of the primary reasons for an MSA? Well, it's to stop people running out of fuel. If we are going to move away from hydrocarbons, diesel and petrol, then the need for those petrol filling stations will diminish. That has an economic impact on these operations because, of course, they are a component of the income stream. But equally, they'll need to be replaced by something else, unless we are going to end up with batteries which will last us for 1,000 miles between charges or 500 miles between charges. Then there will need to be charging infrastructure. Even if we get a range of 1,000 miles, which certainly won't be this first wave of electric cars, then people are still going to need to stop, because not only would government guidance strongly recommend that you don't drive 1,000 miles without taking a break, but I think even one's self-interest might, or immediate physical needs might require that you stop every so often. So those challenges are clear as to how to adapt to that. There's also the physical infrastructure point. We see, there was the first wave of the Tesla chargers going in, which took up some car parking spaces on existing facilities. Now there is greater uptake of electric vehicles. The last thing that you are going to want to do as a driver is not only to have to wait while your vehicle charges, but perhaps even worse than that, wait in a queue to actually get onto a vehicle charger. And if you've only got 10 miles left in the battery, you don't have any choice in the matter. So what I have seen is a much greater need for, effectively land take and physical infrastructure in order to provide charging facilities to meet the needs of the travelling public. That inevitably feeds into the case for a new development as well, because there's going to be a greater effect, if I can use that word neutrally, in terms of landscape, visual impact, land take, how that might affect the variety of different planning considerations for a new motorway service area.
Well, that's brought us right up to date. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolute pleasure.
Till the next time.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Be good to have you back. Thank you, Christian. With great thanks to Christian, we now turn to Thea, who's going to elaborate and dig a bit deeper into the question of VSC, very special circumstances. Thea, hello and good afternoon. How are you?
Really well, Richard. It's Friday.
Hey, fantastic. It's Friday, so it must be a very special circumstance. Go on then, tell me, what is top of your list in terms of ways to get a good application before an authority, or a way to find a route through an appeal if you're in a greenbelt case?
So I think the first thing to remember, well, it's these three words, isn't it? Very special circumstances. They are three words that strike fear into the heart of planners, applicants, and appellants. But really, it's a balance. It's not one particular feature or factor. Very special circumstances is a balance. So you are looking for things to put in the positive side of that balance in order to reach very special circumstances. But of course, the other side of the balance is outweighing the harm, not only to the green belt, but any other harm that arises. So the first thing that you want to look at is actually finding a good site where there's really limited harm, because the more harm you have, either through greenbelt, through landscape, through heritage, ecology, whatever it might be, the more you're going to need on the other side of the balance to outweigh that harm. So find a good site, stage one, that's nice and enclosed, that has something to offer. So you don't just want to say, well, for example, this is an application for housing and we're going to give some market housing and a policy compliant level of affordable housing. That's not going to be good enough in a greenbelt site. You want to find a site that adds something more. So what are the top things that you can use to make a very special circumstances case? You want a really fertile planning context, first of all. So you need to be looking at the plan. If you've got a bang up to date plan and you're not in it and you're in the green belt and your greenfield site, well, you're really giving yourself a mountain to climb. You want somewhere where the plan is old, where it's out of date, where it doesn't make sufficient provision for housing, where that really forward planning process and context has broken down. What would be really good for your site is if you are in an emerging plan. Are you a proposed allocation? Is there an evidence base that supports your site coming forward that says, well, actually, this is a site that doesn't contribute very well to greenbelt purposes? It is a site that housing could come forward on. And, if the council is supporting you as a draft allocation, even better.
So those matters seem to me to be really helpful in us understanding how to translate that experience into other contexts. And we've had separately a brilliant discussion with Christian on the topic of MSAs. Are any of those sorts of experiences which you've plainly acquired, are any of those translatable to other forms of development?
I think it's about establishing need. So it's about having a need for your development and exploiting that particular need and getting the evidence to back it up. So whether it's for housing or business or warehousing, whatever it might be, if there is a need for your development and an evidence base that supports both the need and perhaps the site specifics of your site as being suitable to meet that need, those are really helpful points in making a VSC case.
So, to use your brilliant phrase, fertile planning circumstances, fertile planning policy context, along with need, and all of this is trying to overcome those three key words in the VSC test: any other harm. You're trying to get over any other harm arising from the development, in addition to the greenbelt harm, which is in your super site not going to be very substantial. That's what you're aiming at, is it?
Those are some parts of it. I think the other thing that you need to think about, and I would say this is, looking for a gold standard scheme. There's no point in coming along, as I said, and just offering a bog standard version of whatever development it is that you're promoting. Because if you can offer more, say, for example, in a housing scheme, it doesn't have to be just more affordable housing, although we know so many places are crying out for affordable housing. If it can be biodiversity enhancements or opening up a part of your site for public access, then those really do fall squarely within what paragraph 145 of the framework is trying to achieve in terms of opening up the green belt for recreational use, for example. So if you can provide those as well. Some of the appeal decisions that we've seen recently in terms of the housing context have been successful because of these other benefits that they've offered. For example, land to expand a school. That's an additional extra that's very site specific, where an inspector can look at that site and say, well, okay, I'm not just saying that sites in the green belt should be released for housing. I'm saying that this particular site in the Greenbelt should be released for housing because it brings about this site-specific benefit that may not be repeated elsewhere, and that's what gets you over the threshold of very special circumstances.
And that might have some fertile planning context associated with it. There might be some development plan support for your school. What I imagine is you're trying to draw that into what you so succinctly put at the beginning is it's a balance, and you're drawing that into the balance.
Absolutely, but I think probably applicants and appellants need to be a bit smarter about the way they go about greenbelt sites and look, of course, at the development plan, but very often you're going to be dealing with a development plan that's out of date if you want that fertile planning context that we spoke about, because a bang up to date plan is not going to be the context necessarily in which you want to bring forward a difficult site. And I think we have to acknowledge that greenbelt sites are difficult. And despite the Colney Heath decision, for example, that people will be familiar with, there's no general rule now that the Greenbelt is open for development. It's always going to be tricky to deliver housing on these sites. So look beyond the plan, look to the particular local area that you're in. Very often there'll be a neighbourhood plan, for example, that might set out some priorities. And of course, that is part of the development plan. But even if it's coming forward as an emerging document, that might say something really useful about the community's priorities that you would want to look at. There may be softer forms of a neighbourhood development plan. So, for example, the parish council have got together and they've come up with a plan for their area that doesn't meet those statutory requirements, but can still provide you with some information about what it is that the community really wants. I mean, imagine getting community support because you're delivering a greenbelt site that brings about some goodies for local people as well. That can only be a good thing in trying to establish VSC.
So, on the one hand, looking for a site which is not causing too much harm to the greenbelt in terms of openness, definitional harm always there, but openness key, and then really turning to what you can add into the mix.
Absolutely, Richard. And I should say as well, in respect to paragraph 149 of the framework, previously developed land is always something. If you get a previously developed site in the Greenbelt that has an obvious curtilage as well that could potentially be delivered under paragraph 149, then that's something useful to look at as well. You're still going to have to consider the tests under that paragraph, which are either not having a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt than the existing development, or alternatively not causing substantial harm, where the developments were using that PDL and contributing to meeting an identified affordable housing need. But those are the sorts of considerations when looking for sites in the Greenbelt that you would want to have in mind.
That's wonderful. People will be very grateful to you for that, Thea, in combination with Christian's contribution. That's such a useful combination of material that helps us get through understanding what's going on in MSAs and their interaction, as so typically is the case with the Greenbelt. So thank you very much indeed. Enjoy your Friday evening when you get to it.
You too, Richard. Thank you.
That was the Planning Podcast from Number 5 Chambers. The next episode turns to the Court of Appeal and an important case which raises really difficult issues about the regulation of environmental developments and how they interact with the human rights of those who might be affected. Till then, thank you for listening and goodbye.